We are now going to turn our attention to the great Roman epic, modeled in many ways on Homeric works like the Iliad and the Odyssey. This is a work by the great Latin poet Vergil, Publius Vergilius Maro. He left us a work that is called the Aeneid, and it was written during the height of Rome, I guess you could say, the golden age of Rome, and it was written for the great emperor, the first emperor of Rome, a guy by the name of Augustus. So we're going to dig in now, and we're going to do, again, a little bit of background. This is going to be the first story that we're dealing with that actually comes from Rome. And a lot of people get confused and think, well, Rome, what's the difference between Rome versus Greece? Well, there are big differences between the Greeks and the Romans. But the Greeks definitely had a big impact on Roman culture, and the Romans are happy to, adopt things that are beautiful within the Greek culture. That's one of the benefits of being human beings. We could see beauty and great contributions from all kinds of other cultures and then adopt those into our own. And the Romans were, I don't want to say notorious, I almost did that, really well known for doing that. I mean, they adopt the things that are great in Greece and make it their own. The poetry of Homer would be one of those things. So let's do a little bit of background and talk about the Aeneid, epic Roman hero. So let's talk first about our background for ancient Rome. Since we have not dealt with that yet, it's important that we give us a map. Where is this place called Rome? Well, it's actually spread out quite a ways around the Mediterranean world. Starts off as a very little city-state in the middle of Italy, but by the time of Augustus, this is the map at the time of the first emperor, the turning point from republic to empire, covered the entire Mediterranean for the most part. So everything that you see in the yellow or the green or the light green, dark green, whatever shade of green, those are all directly controlled by Rome by the turn from of the century. Augustus actually comes to the throne technically in 30 BC, takes the title Augustus, which is more of a not a name so much as a title. In 27 BC, we mark this as the beginning of the empire. So this is the map that we're looking at. The pink areas would be areas that are essentially client kingdoms to the Romans. Okay, so they dominated the entire Mediterranean, and Greece is part of that territory. Background, historical sketch, I'm going to kind of go through this very briefly. We're not going to cover all of Roman history, but I do want to get at least up to the reign of Augustus. So I'm going to give you some of the stories that are about early Rome. Now, the Romans, when it comes to mythology, one thing you need to know is a lot of the stories that they have were stories borrowed from the Greeks. I mean, most people tend to think, well, the Roman gods are just the Greek gods given different names. All they did was borrow Greek gods, make them their own, and that's not actually exactly what happened. The Romans had their own gods. The Romans had names of gods like Jupiter and Juno, etc. What the Romans tended to do was borrow the stories that were attached to the Greek gods. So stories of Zeus were then attached to Jupiter. Stories of Ares would be attached to Mars, and so on. We're not going to go through the whole pantheon, but you do need to realize that when we get to the Aeneid, we're going to be looking at, again, the Trojan War, but the names of the gods have been changed, okay? Jupiter. I think I will go through some of the gods just so that you're not completely confused. I'll do this a little bit later if I remember to. Okay, I think it might be in the PowerPoint at some place. Okay, but that's what's going on. When it comes to actual, authentic Roman mythology, the stories they originated of themselves, those are the stories about their early kings, their early heroes, the founding of the city. Those types of things are what the Romans were interested in. They weren't as interested in the stories of the gods. They're a little bit more practical in many ways than the Greeks. So let's talk about this historical sketch that we get from Roman legend. And we're going to start with the story of Troy itself, around 1150, right? This would be when, Troy has fallen, and you've got the exile Aeneas, Prince of Troy, seeking a new homeland for his remaining people. This would have been the voyage takes place to Italy, okay? And that's very much tied into the idea or belief about where Romans originally came from. This was not just something that the Romans themselves believed, but other groups in Italy, like the Etruscans, also had memory, or at least a tradition, about Aeneas arriving in the Italian peninsula. So, next thing, we've got the founding of Rome. This is much, much later, right? 8th century, 753 is the traditional date, actually April 21st, 8 o'clock in the morning. The Romans were incredibly specific. Romulus, the first king, founds the city of Rome, and you may know the story of his infancy, very much like Paris, who was a child given up to exposure to avoid a prophecy. And Oedipus also. Here you've got a pair of twins. Again, not unusual for twins to be born from a god, and the story here is the king of Alba Longa, a king by the name of Numitor, is overthrown by his evil brother Amulius, and to avoid anybody coming back to oust him from the throne, he makes sure that Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, is dedicated to perpetual virginity by serving the goddess Vesta. Then, because you're going to need something to advance the plot, the god Mars shows up and sleeps with Rhea Silvia. She conceives these two twins, and then when the uncle finds out, he wants to get rid of these babies, puts them in a basket and has somebody bring them down to the Tiber River to abandon them, where they're eventually found and raised, temporarily or at least suckled, by a she-wolf who had just given a litter of pups. And then they're raised by a shepherd by the name of Faustulus, who comes along a little bit afterwards. So this is the story of Romulus and Remus, okay, two names that you probably have heard of. Now, Romulus is the one that's going to be the first king, and he begins an era that are known as the Roman monarchy, which is a period from 753 to about 509, 510, where you have 7 kings ruling Rome. These are legendary figures. There are stories of all these guys, but there's no reason to think that these guys are necessarily historical. Again, there could be history woven in. The Romans believed it was history, but again, you know how these oral traditions work out. The kings are Romulus, Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius. Those 4 are Latin kings. Romans were a city. Romans were the citizens of a city-state known as Rome, which happened to be part of group of Latin tribes. Okay, central Italy was occupied by a group of tribes called Latins. They spoke Latin language, and a number of cities outside of Rome that would have been Latin cities. So every Roman at that time would have been a Latin, but not every Latin would have been a Roman. But those first 4 were all Latin ethnically and linguistically. At some point, the story is the city was taken over by Etruscans. The story that's passed down to us is that Tarquinius Priscus, a half Etruscan, half Greek immigrant to Rome, was elected king. And this begins a period of rule by Etruscans. And Etruscans were a neighboring group to the Latins, a little bit more advanced and definitely not an Italic tribe, but and have a big impact on early development of Roman culture. So Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, the last 3 kings, were all supposedly Etruscans. The last of which, Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquinius the Proud, was a corrupt and evil man who deserved the revolution that sprung up against him. I'm not going to go into the story of the rape of Lucretia and what transpires leading to the revolt, but in 509, a guy by the name of Lucius Junius Brutus leads a revolt, ousting the Etruscans, and then he sets up a new government. Kingship is gone, a republic is created. All right, now a republic was what the early years of Rome were going to be. The first several centuries before empire were all under a government type very much like the one in the United States, a republic, a representative democracy for the most part. Okay, now I'm not going to go into the whole idea of how Rome is structured. If you're interested in that, my humanities class, I cover ancient Rome in pretty good detail as a historical sketch, but I am going to give you a historical sketch of the Middle Republic because it's relevant to the story, and that's what I want to concentrate on, are the events in Roman history that are relevant to the Epic of the Aeneid, because it is a historical epic in very many ways. So around 390, the city of Rome suffers a really bad sacking. The Celts, the Gauls from northern Italy basically filtered down into central Italy and burned the city of Rome. This is kind of a low point. The Romans kind of vow never to allow their city to fall prey to such an event again, and really build for themselves a series of walls and do a good job keeping enemies out. Actually, for the next 800 years, the city of Rome won't be sacked by anything other than another Roman army. Now, one big challenge that comes up in the Middle Republic is a challenge from foreigners. I guess I wore it with Pyrrhus. I should have put that in. I didn't think to do that. I was going to jump past that, but since it's here, 280 to 275 is the war with Pyrrhus of Epirus. This is a Macedonian-style army from the north of Greece. Pyrrhus Epirus is actually right there next to Macedonia. So this is kind of Rome's first interaction with Greek warfare. And it's going to help shape Greece, shape the Romans. Their interaction with Greece is going to be a long-standing process where they're eventually going to come to dominate Greece. Not long after, you have what is known as the Punic Wars. The first Punic War, 264 to 241, is going to involve Rome against Carthage. Now, Carthage, that's the major enemy. And there are 3 wars that are fought with Carthage, all of which Rome wins, but not all of them are very easy victories. I mean, the first Punic War is over 20 years. They take Sicily in the end, humiliate the Carthaginians. But in the second war, from 218 to 201, you have payback. Carthage, under the command of a general by the name of Hannibal, brings his armies into Italy, the famous crossing of the Alps with his elephants. He arrives and dominates the Italian mainland for the next 15 or so years. Unbeaten. He's the arch enemy. He's the guy the Romans used to tell their children about. He was the boogeyman. If you didn't behave as a Roman child, the parents would tell their children that Hannibal is going to come and get you. Okay? And that should hopefully cause children to fear, because the Romans feared him. He eventually was defeated at the Battle of Zama in North Africa by the great Roman general Scipio Africanus. Okay? So the Romans emerged again victorious, but it was a long, hard-fought battle. Now, the reason I'm bringing up Carthage, if you didn't already read the text, is because Carthage is going to be one of the places that Aeneas is going to stop on his voyage to his ultimate destiny in Italy. Okay, so I'm going to get back to that. This is all really, really important. Carthage was later destroyed after the Third Punic War, 149 to 146. The city's decimated. Okay, it's later rebuilt as a colony of the Romans, but for now, it's left in ruins by Roman destruction. And that's the end of Carthage as, it was a Punic city, meaning it's Phoenician. I don't know if I mentioned that, but the Phoenicians were a group from basically the Levant, the far eastern portion of the Mediterranean. So around the same time, Second Punic War and on, you've got also the conquest of Greece going on. There are a number of wars with Macedon and the Greeks. Ultimately, by 148 or so, all of Greece is now captured by Rome. And it's with this series of wars that you start to have lots and lots of Greek material being brought to Rome. Not that Greeks hadn't already influenced the Romans, because the southern portion of Italy happened to be settled by lots of Greeks very early on, and those city-states were in contact with Rome very early in their history. But through the conquest of Greece, you have the importation of lots of Greek art, you have lots of Greek ideas, Greek mythology continues to come in, Greek everything, right? It becomes really rather a phenomenon among the Romans, a passion for Greek luxury. But there is going to be a little bit of a blowback among the more conservative Romans. Also, in the year 146, not only is Carthage destroyed, but the great Greek city of Corinth is leveled and destroyed as well. Now, when we get to the late Republic, we've got a really troublesome century, the last century BC, or the first century BC. Civil war, a series of civil wars. As a matter of fact, 3 civil wars wreck the entire Roman world. The first civil war fought between a guy by the name of Marius and his popular support within the assembly versus Sulla and his senatorial class support. Tears apart the empire briefly. But the Roman Republic limps on afterward. But there's definitely a vulnerability in this last century that's revealed. The Republic is going to disappear. The next alliance that forms that's going to result in a civil war is an alliance by a few very famous figures. Definitely Julius Caesar, you've heard of. Crassus and Pompey, maybe. They form what's known as the First Triumvirate in 60 BC. Caesar emerges as the dominant figure in that group and comes to a civil war with Pompey. 49 BC. He defeats Pompey. Pompey is later killed by the Egyptian. Caesar ultimately becomes dictator for life, dictator perpetuus. Behaves a little bit like a king, results in a plot against him, which is carried out on a famous date, the Ides of March in 44 BC. He's ambushed by a group of senators at a Senate meeting at the Theater of Pompey, kind of poetic justice, where he's stabbed to death, leaving a vulnerable state, and in the gap step a few other figures, a group that's going to be known as the Second Triumvirate, but it's also going to result in civil war. 2 of the members of this alliance, Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony, which was one of Caesar's most important generals, are going to face off against each other. The Battle of Actium takes place in 31 BC. Mark Antony is supported by his lover, the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, North African queen. Now, when Octavian goes to war, to avoid the appearance of civil war, which is not what the Romans wanted, he declares war against Egypt. He goes on to defeat Antony and Cleopatra. As a matter of fact, his general, his admiral, Marcus Agrippa, is responsible for the victory. Octavian is not really known for his military brilliance, but he was a brilliant politician. Anyways, in 30 BC, Antony and Cleopatra commit suicide. Octavian, now the sole man in charge of the state, will in 27 BC, take a new title, and he's going to be known as Augustus Caesar. And that's the end of the Republic. But it was not actually apparent to the people at the time that it was the end of the Republic. It's the beginning of the empire, because now you have a figure that is going to be known as the emperor. But Augustus is very careful as he does this. Like I said, he's a brilliant politician, a brilliant strategist, in that he's going to avoid the pitfalls of Julius Caesar. He's not going to make himself look like a king. He's not going to go by the name emperor. He goes by various other titles, but he wants the state to look like a fully functioning republic. And that was his goal. And it's because of this emphasis on reviving the old Roman Republic that he's going to sponsor the writing of the Aeneid. Okay? Augustus is a refounder. He's a new king. After a century of civil war, he is the new Romulus. The collapsing republic was pretty bad, right? Civil war is not just part, it was just part of it. Also, you've got Roman religion being neglected from his perspective. There were temples that fell into disrepair. They were not being maintained. There was a moral failing within the state. A lot of the late Republican writers, not only Augustus, believed this was the case. You also see that influence of Greek culture, kind of the luxuries, the softness of the foreign world polluting Rome. A lot of people believed this was a corrupting influence. As much as they loved Greek culture, there's something negative about it. It made the Roman virtue dwindle, Roman ability to endure hardship weaken. Right? This loss of traditional Roman values was believed to be taking place, and those values would be such things as pietas, gravitas, and virtus. I'm going to talk about them again in a second, because this is part of the theme now of the Aeneid. So let me tell you what these words mean. Pietas is usually translated as piety, and we think of it today as a religious devotion. And in a certain sense, there was an element of religion involved. But for the Romans, it was more an idea of duty. I know I gave you this term earlier in the semester, but it's this idea of a hierarchical duty, one's responsibility to the gods at the top, to the state, to one's people, to one's dependents and family. And at the very end of the list, if at all on the list, is yourself, right? Your own personal goals and aspirations should be the last thing, right? That's what makes a good Roman a good Roman. Gravitas has to do with sobriety, serious-mindedness, right? Romans weren't supposed to be given over to luxury and frivolity and those types of things, which is why they weren't really, huge producers of art the way the Greeks were. And then virtus, which is the word we get virtue from. And this is bravery, this is manliness, this is courage. This is what was expected. And Augustus saw the state as not having those, right? The Roman men of the era were lacking in these qualities, and he wants to bring that back. Augustus presents himself as a new Romulus, a new founder of the city. He claims to have found the city a city of brick, and he leaves it a city of marble. It's a reformation. Now, in this period, he sponsors, he becomes the patron to the poet Vergil for the production of Rome's national epic. Publius Vergilius Maro lived between 70 and 19 BC. He is the Homer of Rome. That's not an understatement. He was as brilliant a poet as Homer was, without a doubt, though he's working in a literary tradition. This is not primary epic, it's secondary epic. So he's not working off an oral composition or oral tradition, though he is drawing on the oral tradition that has come down to him. So he's not making up a new story or a new myth, but he's crafting some brilliant and original poetry. And he is the master of Latin poetry. He's commissioned by Augustus to write the Aeneid with a mission to compose a national epic, and he works on it from basically 29 to 19, about 10 years. He died in 19 BC, right? This is why the work was never actually finished. Now, the story is that he did not want the work published. He wanted it burned. He wasn't happy for some reason, wanted to rework it, maybe change some parts, but luckily for us, Augustus loved it, published it contrary to his wishes, and saved it from destruction. Okay? So it is going to go on, of course, to become one of the most influential works of Western and even world literature. This picture, by the way, is a later picture, obviously not an ancient picture, of the episode where Virgil is reading Book 6 of the Aeneid to Augustus, his wife, and sister. And the story is that his sister Octavia fainted during the reading of the poem when Virgil actually mentioned her dead son Marcellus. He actually shows a lot of famous Roman individuals in the course of the epic, so that's again, part of the mission that I'll talk about in just a little bit. All right, so there are a number of pictures that you can find of Vergil and Augustus, this being another one, same scene, Octavia fainting at the mention of her deceased son. Now here's the purposes, from Augustus's point of view. He wants to promote a political and a social worldview, right, in an effort to revive the lost republic, or the falling republic. So he commissions the Aeneid for several particular points. That's kind of a general purpose. Now I'm going to look at some specific things that he wanted it to do. He commissioned it to link Rome to the greatness of the Greek heroic age. Right? Greece was great. Greece had a wonderful collection of stories about the heroes of the past. Rome wants to be attached to that. But at the same time, you got to be very careful because the Greek culture was also viewed as a corrupting influence. So he also wants there to be distance between the Romans and the Greeks. And this is really perfect to make your hero the Trojan, right? It's not the Greeks that are the good guys, it's the Trojans that are the good guys. So it's tied to Homer, but it's distanced from Greece at the same time. This is important. It also provides a divine destiny for Rome. That's a big function of the epic, is to show why Roman history unfolded as it did, to show that Rome is guided by the gods. Everything happens for a reason and a purpose. You probably heard this idea of manifest destiny. That's what Augustus is promoting. He wants to also provide a divine lineage for himself. He's part of what's known as the Julian clan. Okay, they trace their ancestry back to the child of Aeneas, Ascanius, or also known as Iulus. That's supposedly the eponymous ancestor of the Julian clan in Rome. So, here he is. He's emperor, and he's tied back to the founder, literally, of Rome. He explains all of Roman history as being guided again by fate, by gods. Things don't happen for a reason. There's a mission the gods have given us, and also, most importantly probably, to promote the traditional Roman virtues and morality that I thought were disappearing. So when he crafts the character of Aeneas, Aeneas is the epitome of Roman virtue. We're going to see this in a little bit. Now, the whole story of Aeneas is not something, like I said, Vergil just makes up from nowhere. He's working on a tradition that's been with us in literature going all the way back to Homer at least. Again, the setting for Aeneas, end of the Bronze Age, right? It's the Trojan War. He's a refugee. Right after Troy, right, archaeologically we know this was a period where the sea peoples were sailing around the eastern Mediterranean, sacking cities, attacking Egypt and whatnot. That may be where the whole story of these wanderings comes from, because the story of Aeneas is clearly a story of a man from the region of Anatolia who migrates by sea with his people, seeking a new homeland. Okay? Possibly a vague memory of this period. We don't really know for sure. Okay? And like I said, in the last lecture, there were other wandering stories like the story of Odysseus. Okay? But eventually this character of Aeneas is going to arrive in Italy. That's his final destination. Now, Homer talks about Aeneas, and I didn't talk about this when we did the Iliad, but I do want to talk about it now because there's a really important reference to Aeneas in that work. As a matter of fact, this is the first written reference to the character of Aeneas, referred to as Aeneas Anchisiades, meaning Aeneas the son of Anchises. Okay, kind of the Greek spelling. The story in the Iliad, you see a scene, a few times he shows up on the battlefield, but the most important one is when he faces off against Achilles, right? This is at the end when Achilles has come back to the fight. Aeneas one-on-one with Achilles, right? The two of the best warriors. Of course, Achilles is much better than Aeneas, nobody doubts. In the course of the battle, Aeneas picks up a boulder, right? He's a massive and powerful hero, and he picks it up and he's about to drop the boulder on top of Achilles, who's kind of below him, about to draw his sword and stab upward. They both lost their spears. Now the gods are watching. The gods are always watching. And they stop the fight. They freeze the scene and start to discuss among themselves what they should let happen. Do they let the fight continue? They say, here's what's going to happen if we do. Aeneas is going to drop that boulder right on top of Achilles. It's going to bounce off that armor made by Hephaestus. Achilles will be fine. But as he draws his sword, he's going to stab Aeneas, and he's probably going to kill Aeneas. Can we allow this to happen? And they decide no. We cannot allow Aeneas to die because there's a destiny. There's mention here of a prophecy that he is destined to become the leader of the Trojans. And they teleport him off the battlefield to safety. And that's pretty much the end we see, and end of him in the story, right? And it's just this little reference in Homer, which leads to a whole developing tradition afterward. And what happens? What is this destiny? What do they mean, leader of the Trojans? Okay, so lots of other works pick up the tale from there. The next big mention, I guess, comes in the late 8th century with Hesiod's Theogony. We find out about Aeneas. He is the son of the goddess Aphrodite. All right, okay, so we have an account of his birth. Again, Aphrodite, the Trojan side of the war, right? She's the one that started the battle. In the 7th century, the Cupria by Stasinos, which I mentioned before, last in the other lecture, summarized in Proclus's Christomachy. This is where we get references to what happened in that work, because the Cupria, remember, is lost. Mentions that Aeneas was with Paris at Sparta. Now, he's not necessarily blamed for the abduction of Helen, but he was present when Paris does this. We then go into the 7th century Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. We have another reference to the birth of Aeneas from Aphrodite. And then when we get to the 6th and 5th centuries, we got a few things to look at. Acusilaus, one of the mythographers, who says Aphrodite actually started the war at Troy in order to give the throne to her son Aeneas. That's one explanation for why the war began. The Eleopersis, or Persis of Arctinus, mentions recounts Aeneas' flight. Sorry, I got a little tongue-tied there. So basically this is going to cover, again, Eleopersis means the destruction of Troy, the fall of Troy. So this is going to count how he gets out of the city with the refugees. And then Hellanicus mentions Aeneas' escape as well. And then here is an example of a red figure Attic vase painting. We've got black figure and red figure in the background. You can see actually a black figure vase. I should have pointed that out earlier. This is a picture of Aeneas with his father Anchises on his back. The red figure vase painting in the lower corner, also a picture of Aeneas carrying his father Anchises on his back. This is the general way artists throughout the centuries have depicted the hero Aeneas. A devoted guy carrying his crippled father from the ruins or burning ruins of Troy to safety. Kind of a picture of devotion. That's what he's going to be most known for. And these vases were not only popular in the Greek world, they're also found in Italy, particularly in Etruria. A lot of importation of Greek vase painting into the Etruscan territories. So we've got evidence of, the story of Aeneas coming into Italy pretty early on, 6th, 5th century. They were well known. There is also this interesting coin, which represents another tradition in the Chalcidice, which Chalcidice is the northern portion of the Aegean Sea. There was a city there by the name of Aenea, which was named after the hero. This is kind of the founding hero of that particular city, and they had coins minted with the hero's face on it, going to this time frame as well. So it's not just Rome that traced their lineage back to Aeneas, but it was other cities in the Greek world. Anyways, the legend of Aeneas as it develops after the 5th century and the 4th century, Menecrates of Xanthos accuses Aeneas of betraying the city. This is one negative mark on his record. Again, it's a late tradition, not the earliest version. By the 3rd century, you've got another several works. Cugnegetus, that's a tongue twister. Cugnegeticus by Xenophon of Alexandria, by Lycophron, mention Aeneas' piety. Right, so he starts to be really identified as the devoted, pious, dutiful character that he's going to be in the Aeneid. In the 3rd century, when we get to Latin writers now, the Bellum Punicum, this is a history of the Punic War by the poet Naevius, mentions Aeneas as one who negotiates his release, a survivor of Troy. Also mentions the founding of Carthage and the queen known as Dido. Okay, so he covers all that. And again, he's writing about the wars with Carthage, so it's appropriate that he includes some of Carthaginian lore, the founding of the city by the queen. And Roman history, he ties Romulus back to Aeneas as his grandson, which is a little too close chronologically, but Vergil will fix this. Then you have in the 2nd century the Annales by Ennius, another Roman writer who mentions Romulus as the grandson of Aeneas, which really brings us up to the Aeneid. So here's Vergil. Pious Aeneas, the most common epithet attached to the man in the entire work. He is supposed to be the ideal Roman. He is going to represent the virtue of piety, right there tied to his name. You can't miss the implication, what kind of character he is. Without even seeing his actions, you know what he is supposed to represent. Again, the main virtues, pietas, gravitas, virtus. He might be somewhat of a flat character in some ways. He's definitely not as passionate as an Achilles or an Odysseus. Some people have criticized the epic for giving us a character who's less colorful than many of the heroes from the ancient Greek world, but that's part of the point, right? He's a man in control. He's a man, at least for the most part, in control and representing the ideal serious man. Another virtue that's worth talking about is justitia, or justice. We'll talk about the cardinal virtues a little bit later, but those are what he represents. The opening lines of the poem, like we looked at the opening lines when we talked about the Iliad, the opening lines in the Aeneid, very important. Arma virumque cano. He says, I am going to sing of arms and the man. This is how we open. Again, he's setting aside, or setting right out in the beginning, the theme. If you go down to line 10 of the poem, Insignem pietate virum, he's talking about a man of piety, well known for his piety. Okay, so right there in the opening, and I'll read a translation of it so that you can follow along. This one's neat. I'll just include a few versions or a few different translations for the sake of showing you the difference between poetry and prose. Since we're dealing with poetry, right, what we have here is the Latin poetry of Vergil. And like I said, he was a brilliant poet. Some of the greatest lines in Latin poetry come in the Aeneid. But when you translate into English, I think I mentioned this maybe before, there's always the question of how should you do the translation? Should you try to be literal, capture the meaning of each word, or should you try to do it in the by capturing the poetry? In the very famous Dryden translation, which dates to 1697, he decided he was going to go with the poetic, translating Latin poetry into English poetry. So just listen to the poetry. You got to take some liberties with the language and the vocabulary to do this, but he starts off, arms and the man I sing, who, forced by fate and haughty Juno's unrelenting hate, expelled and exiled, left the Trojan shore, long labors both by sea and land he bore. And in the doubtful war, before he won the Latian realm and built the destined town, his banished gods, restored to rights divine, and settled sure succession in his line, and whence the race of Alban fathers come, and the long glories of majestic Rome. O Muse, here's the invocation. Right, just like Homer starts with invoking the muse, so does Vergil, writing in the same tradition. Matter of fact, he's writing in the same meter, dactylic hexameter, as Homer did, by the way. Anyways, O Muse, the causes and the crimes relate. What goddess was provoked and whence her hate? And what offense the queen of heaven began to persecute so brave, so just a man? So you get this idea that he's got this destiny. He's going to sing about where he is come to found a city. Right? The Alban Fathers is a reference to the city of Alba Longa, which was the home city by tradition from which Rome came. Romulus and Remus were born in Alba Longa before Rome was founded. And then at the end, they talk about the muse kind of inspiring this, and it's the Queen of Heaven, basically Juno, the goddess, who has this hatred out for Aeneas. Now, a more literal translation might be one like this. This is a very recent one, 2002, by A.S. Klein. I sing, and if you didn't catch everything in the poetic version, this should be a little bit more clear as well, because it's not an attempt to do poetry, but prose. I sing of arms and the man, he who, exiled by fate, first came from the shores of Troy to Italy, and to Lavinian shores, that's the area that he lives, Latium, basically. Hurled about endlessly by land and sea, by the will of the gods, by cruel Juno's remorseless anger, long-suffering also in war, until he founded a city and brought his gods to Latium. From that, the Latin people came, the lords of Alba Longa, the walls of noble Rome. And then he says, Muse, tell me the cause, and he's going to get to this whole idea of virtue. So again, various versions of the opening lines, okay, sets the theme, and that's exactly what the theme is, a man of piety. Vergil is the new Homer. Like I said, he models his poetry on Homeric poetry, and he then shapes the poem based on both Homeric epics. We could break it into two. It's a 12-book work. First 6 books are modeled on the Odyssey, so we could say it's the new Odyssey. The last 6 books are modeled on the Iliad, so this is going to be a new Iliad. I'm going to come back to this at the end and show you how this works. Okay, but for the most part, the first 6 books are about a voyage at sea. The last 6 books are about war over a woman. Okay, so the audience would have been able to pick up on all these things. Now, the Odyssey of Aeneas. Let's start with part 1. It's going to begin like all great epics in medias res, in the middle of things. We're going to do our flashback to get to the place we're going. We're going to start kind of in Carthage, right there in North Africa, right directly south of Italy. Then we're going to do our flashback to Troy, which is located right there on the tip of the Aegean world, kind of on its way into the Black Sea. And eventually we're going to arrive in Rome, right there in central Italy, Latium, the territory. There's not going to be a city, Rome, just yet, but there will be a territory that we're going to look at. So this is the voyage. If we're going to trace his voyage, like the voyage of Odysseus, we're going to wander quite a while for a number of years throughout the Mediterranean, bumping into things along the way. That's the general route most people think the story describes, but ultimately he is going to arrive in his destination, Italy. Now, first, let's talk about his stop over in Carthage, because this is where we begin the tale. We've got Juno, the goddess who is angry with the Trojans, right? This is Hera, right? Who is always angry with somebody for some reason. She gets the god Aeolus to give her access to the winds. He's the wind god. And she decides to send a storm against the Trojan fleet, Aeneas' ships. And they're scattered before the god of the seas, Neptune, the Roman counterpart to Poseidon, settles the seas down, kind of angry that Juno dare do this in his realm. Ultimately, what happens at the end of this storm is the ships have been scattered. Aeneas, who is alone on his major, the main ship, thinks the fleet's been lost. They've been sunk. They've been crashed on the rocks. He doesn't know what's happened to them. He's lost sight of them. And he eventually arrives in North Africa down the coast from the city of Carthage. Here, we find out a little bit from Venus about his destiny. Jupiter, Venus, the future of Rome is kind of all laid out. Now, Aeneas is told by his mother, actually shows up in disguise, that he needs to make his way down to Carthage, and she conceals him in a fog, right? He walks into the city of Carthage unbeknownst to anybody else. I don't know how to describe it. You can kind of picture it in your mind, I guess, the fog kind of rolling in through the gates of the city. And, when the fog departs, there's Aeneas, who's going to be standing there in front of the queen. And the whole idea of hiding him is because you don't know yet if the queen of the city, a woman by the name of Dido, is going to be a friend or an enemy. Well, he comes to find out that when Aeneas gets to the town, his ships had already arrived ahead of him. The rest of the fleet was not lost. They were saved, thanks to Jupiter, and they arrived safely at Carthage, and she's already dealing with them. She's welcoming them in, and when he finds out that she's going to be a friend and not an enemy, that's when the mist evaporates, and there he is, standing there right in front of the queen. And she extends hospitality. She welcomes Aeneas to Carthage, and you got this guest host thing working out. But it's going to be more than a guest host relationship. Eventually, it's going to be a romance, but the hospitality is where it starts. Okay. Now, part of the hospitality, she's going to set out a banquet to welcome her new visitors. And she actually says, go back and call your son, who is on the boat right now. He's a boy at this time, Ascanius, to come to the banquet. She wants to host the whole family and, learn about him and all this kind of stuff. And this is where Venus, and I'm going to be tempted to use the word Aphrodite over and over again, but Venus, the goddess of love, is going to intervene. And rather than send Ascanius to his father, she replaces the boy with her son Cupid. This is the god Eros. Happens to be the brother of Aeneas, if you think about the family tree now. Cupid comes in disguise as Ascanius, the son of Aeneas. So here's the boy. You can see in this painting with the wings on his back that kind of gives you an idea that we're dealing with Cupid. This is not Ascanius. Now, what happens next is our flashback. All right, we're going to go right down to the pivotal fall of the city. And what happens at the banquet is Dido asks to tell the tale. She's heard of the fall of Troy already. She wants to know what happened. And Aeneas says it's not a pretty story. You probably don't want to hear that, but I will abide and kind of lay it out for you. So he begins the story, and he tells this during the dinner. And it begins with the story of the Trojan horse. So here's kind of how it works out. And it's really brilliantly told by Vergil. It's kind of a trick using reverse psychology. A lot of people think, this big wooden horse where you've got a bunch of Greek people hiding inside it. How could the Trojans be so stupid as to bring the thing into the city? And when you read Vergil's account, you actually come away going, I think I might have brought the horse in too. Because it's laid out like this. The Greeks have broken into the city of Troy. They've stolen a cult statue of the goddess Athena, who happens to be on their side anyways. This is going to be Minerva in Roman mythology. desecrate the temple and need to make it look like there's been a sacrilegious action taking place, and the Greeks need to make up to the gods somehow. So what they decide to do is they build this horse. Odysseus is usually in on the construction project, but inside the horse are going to be the greatest of the Greek warriors, and they're going to be hidden inside. They're going to leave the horse on the shore. The rest of the Greek army is going to pack up the boats, pack up the camp, and sail away, and make it look like the Greeks have just given up. After 10 years of war, they're probably tired. It's probably believable. What they actually end up doing is sailing around behind an island and hiding a little ways off the coast. They leave behind a simple Greek soldier by the name of Sinon. Now, Sinon is a nobody, but he's hiding in the bushes. When the Trojans look out in the morning and they see the Greek camp packed up and gone, no sign of the Greeks except for this wooden statue of a horse, they start to wonder what the heck has gone on, and we want to go down and investigate. So they go down. And what they do is they find this guy, Sinon, and they drag him from his hiding spot, and they're like, all right, let's kill this guy. There's a Greek. Let's get rid of this last Greek. And he says, go ahead. Go ahead and kill me. The only thing you're going to be doing if you do that is you're doing a favor to the Greeks, because they were trying to kill me too. All right, this is the reverse psychology. They were going to offer me as a sacrifice to the gods to make up for their crimes against the gods. So the Trojans want to hear a little bit more. He said, all right, tell us what happened. And he says, all right, I was part of a human sacrifice, but they also left this big statue, this big wooden horse, as an offering to the gods. And they made it so big to prevent you from taking it to the city, because, whoever possesses the horse, those are the ones that the gods are going to favor. Now they're starting to think, well, maybe we should take it into the city. But there's still people that are warning against it. And not everybody's that foolish. One of the most important figures is a guy by the name of Laocoon. He's a priest from Troy, and he comes up. This is my favorite Hellenistic statue, by the way, the Laocoon. It's in the Vatican Museum. He comes up and says, don't fall for the trick. He actually takes his spear and throws it into the side of a horse. And he says, this is a trick. This is something that's going to bring destruction on the Greeks. And in him doing this, remember, the gods are on the Greek side. When he harms the horse, some serpents immediately come out of the sea, wrap themselves around Laocoon and his sons, and kill them right on the spot, right in front of everybody. So it really does look like the gods are protecting the thing. So you can't get rid of it. People have been saying, burn it, throw it into the sea, just don't take it into the city. What really seals the deal is Cassandra, right? This is a woman we mentioned in the story of the Iliad. She was a prisoner of war after the war by Agamemnon. But Cassandra, remember, is a prophetess. She knows the future. She was given a gift of prophecy by the god Apollo. But then she shunned Apollo's advances, and he cursed her by preventing her, or rather, making it so that she will still prophesy, but nobody will ever believe anything she has to say, which is a horrible fate for a prophet. Anyways, Cassandra comes down and she says, this is a trap. She starts naming guys who are inside the horse, But just the very fact that she opens her mouth means nobody is going to believe a word she says. They're actually going to believe the opposite. So what they do is they take down part of the gate. They make it so the horse fits inside the city, compromising their defenses. And when they celebrate their victory over the Greeks and drink themselves into a stupor and then crash at the end of the party, leaving the city vulnerable, Sinon opens the gate and the horse, and out come the Greek soldiers. They open the city gates, and they send up the signal to get the ships to sail back. And by morning, the entire city is on fire. The Greeks are working their way down every street and alleyway, burning everything. And here's where Aeneas comes out. He has a dream where he sees the ghost of Hector warning him to leave. He says, the city's lost. There's no point in staying here. Take your household gods, go on. You've got a destiny to found a new city. Again, this whole future idea is tied in with this warning. Right? It's always important to listen to the spirits of the ancestors, and Hector's ghost gives this warning. So he does just that. He goes back into the city, tries actually to fight a little bit, fight off the Greeks, but it's really hopeless. And he goes back, gathers together his father, crippled father, old man Anchises, and his young son Ascanius. And again, here's an image. This is Baroque style sculpture by Bernini, one of my favorite Baroque sculptors. Picture of Aeneas carrying his father Anchises. Just like those vase paintings we looked at. Again, this is the image not only from the ancient Greek world, but in the Renaissance, the Baroque era. Lots of modern art deal with the image of Aeneas doing this very thing. So he brings his father and leads his son by the hand and his people down to the port to depart from the city. His wife, Creusa, unfortunately, follows behind him as he makes his way from the city, and the problem is he loses track of her. And when he gets to the boats, he turns around and his wife is gone. But he rushes back into the city of Troy to try to find her, but what he finds is just her ghost. She's been killed. And we get kind of a reinforcement of that message from Hector. She tells him again, you've got a destiny elsewhere. Don't worry about me. You'll marry again. There'll be a future family for you and a future destiny. Go on to this destiny. And essentially he does just that. And you enter now the period of wandering, which is going to be a long, long process. The gods are calling him specifically to Italy. And along the way, he's got lots of adventures. So let's take a look at some of the places that he stops. Some of these are taken directly from the Odyssey, some directly from the story of Jason, but all of which would be familiar to an audience that knows Greek mythology. The Strophides, he stops by where the Harpies reside. And much like Jason and his troops, he engages with the Harpies. But the problem here is the Harpies haven't really done anything to him, and they actually end up cursing him and his men to wandering for a long time until they get so hungry they're going to resort to eating their tables, whatever that means. So this is the cause of his long-term wandering. It's not nearly going to be as long as Odysseus, but still, it's going to be a long suffering before he arrives in his destination. He comes to Actium. This is the place where Augustus defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He has games there. He's bringing in Vergil now, elements of Roman history already, certain important spots along the way. He goes to Buthrotum, where he meets Helenus, the brother of Hector, and Andromache, the widow of Hector, who have now been married. Helenus is a prophet, by the way, who indicates when his wandering will end is when he finds a spot where he sees a white sow suckling some baby pigs. That's the location of where he's eventually going to build his new city, or where the future city will reside. And he also tells him that when he gets to Italy, he's going to go to the Cumaean Sibyl. This is a prophetess down in the southern portion of Italy, city of Cuma, basically, which is a Greek colony. And Avernus, which is the entrance into the Underworld, was located there. So he's going to have an encounter and a trip to the Underworld like all good hero stories must have. He goes by Scylla and Charybdis, which is also pronounced Scylla and Charybdis by most people today. This is the spot where there is the whirlpool and the dog-headed beast, multi-headed dog-headed beast, this passageway where ships have to navigate. It's where we get the idea of between a rock and a hard place from. Anyways, this is a place that you see in the Odyssey. Odysseus went through there, and most of his crew, not most, but a good number of his crewmen met their fate as they passed by. Aeneas actually avoids passing through there very wisely. Goes to the island of the Cyclops, also famous, and when he arrives here, he rescues one of Odysseus' men who was left behind by Odysseus, a guy by the name of Echemenides. Rescues him and takes him with him. Okay, kind of a savior figure here, but avoids the Cyclops, which is really important. He doesn't engage with them the way Odysseus does. So all these various stops along the way, all these little adventures, kind of the fantasy wandering of a new Odyssey. Eventually he arrives in Carthage, and this is where the story comes to an end. By the end of the meal, Dido is completely in love with the guy. She's basically been shot with an arrow from Cupid, but not literally shot, because during the meal, this Cupid has been sitting on her lap the whole time. She thinks it's Aeneas' son, remember. And he's been breathing on her, and the aroma from his breath has made her fall madly in love with Aeneas. And the point of doing this is that Venus wants to protect Aeneas. Now, Juno, Hera, is a fan of Carthage. She is a patron to Dido. And there's this problem that's now emerging because she hates the Trojans. So Venus is kind of trying to secure, some kind of relationship that's going to at least protect them in the short term. Anyways, Juno eventually is going to get them together, and there's a spot where Aeneas goes into a cave. They're out on a hunt, Aeneas and Dido, and a rainstorm takes place, and they take shelter in a cave. And while they're in this cave alone, they end up making love. They have this intimate moment, and she views this moment as a marriage. Now, he doesn't quite view it the same way, but he does love her, and he ends up having a long-term relationship with her. Maybe not long-term in the, I guess short-term when you really think of it, because he's not going to stay with her that long. But this is a very tenuous situation, because Dido has shunned advances by lots of other kings in North Africa. When the Phoenician colony of Carthage was first founded, Dido was the one who brought her people from the city of Tyre to North Africa. And there were kings that wanted to marry her, and she basically said no. She actually fled Tyre after the assassination of her husband. She vowed that she was never going to marry another man. Her husband was the last man she would marry. So here, when the kings locally, Iarbas being a particular king of the region, finds out that she's taken up with this foreigner, Aeneas, after she's shunned him, he becomes angry. So she's in kind of a vulnerable position should there be, any aggression towards her kingdom. But she's madly in love. Now, the problem is Aeneas has a destiny, and Jupiter is going to remind him by sending, now I want to say Hermes, Mercury, down to remind him, don't stay too long. Don't get attached to Carthage. This is not your home. What you need to do, again, the appeal to his duty, his piety, to the gods first, to his people second, go on to Italy. Your future destiny awaits. And he packs up and gets ready to depart, kind of in secret, which is the unfortunate part. But Dido finds out, and she confronts him. He says, were you trying to sneak out of the city without letting me know? And he kind of says, no, I wasn't trying to do that. I was going to tell you. I was just packing up the ships ahead of time, and I was going to come to you before I actually departed. But she's heartbroken at this point. And he, again, has to follow his destiny. He says, let's follow his dharma. And when he leaves, broken-hearted Dido takes her own life. She commits a suicide, and he looks back at the city and sees kind of her funeral pyre with her burning there in the distance. A sad parting of ways, but again, he has to suck it up and do his duty. That's his mission. So this whole episode, the broken relationship, the animosity that's left behind in the broken relationship, is supposed to be there to explain the relationship between Rome and Carthage. The failed love affair is to explain the ultimate conflict between Rome and Carthage that took place during the Middle Republic. There's a curse that's laid out. This is the anger of Juno. All this stuff is going to come back. So it's an explanation of Roman history, particularly the Punic Wars. Right? The gods have a role in Roman history and Roman destiny. And of course, the worst revenge is going to come at the hands of Hannibal, as we saw before, the Second Punic War, the ultimate archenemy of Rome. But one other thing that the audience of Vergil would pick up on with this relationship with Dido is that she is a queen of Carthage. Now, that was the legendary founding of the city of Carthage. It is the story of Queen Elissa of Tyre, who is also known as Dido of Tyre. She was the historical, or rather the legendary founder of the colony of Carthage. But the audience at the time of Augustus, hearing this poem, would immediately think of another North African queen that was an enemy of Rome right from that time period, and that would be Cleopatra, who seduced Mark Antony, right? He was a Roman man who turned his back on Rome and fell in love with Egypt. She seduced him away from Rome, and that's what sparked that third civil war. So here's a queen, Dido, seducing a Roman, Aeneas, but he resists the seduction of the queen and goes on to be loyal to Rome. So this is directly understood in that context. It's a kind of a powerful statement, right? Augustus, remember, is the one who defeated Mark Antony. So that's the context for the Roman audience, and it brings out, I think, a lot more in the story when you look at it from that point of view. Then you've got the descent of the Underworld. This is book 6. They have funeral games in Sicily for Aeneas' father, Anchises, who's passed away, but eventually he arrives in southern Italy, goes to the region of Cuma, and he meets with the Sibyl in her cave. This is Michelangelo's painting of the Sibyl from the Sistine Chapel, one of the great Renaissance painters, one of my favorites. But the Sibyl's Cave, you could actually go there today. If you go to the city I have of Cuma, or Cuma today, but Cumae in the ancient world, the ruins of the Greek settlement there is a cave, right, that is known as the Sibyl's Cave. This is the entrance to the underworld. That's what the Greeks and Romans believed. You could enter the underworld through various holes in the earth. Okay, so the Sibyl's Cave is where he goes. The Sibyl tells him to go and get a golden bough from this tree that's going to pay your way into the underworld. So the golden bough, which is where Fraser gets the name of his great work on mythology, The Golden Bough, is brought by Aeneas to pay the ferry driver Charon across the river into the underworld. So it's a descent into Hades. Now, Not only does Vergil give us the best account of the Trojan horse, he gives us the best description we have of Hades in the ancient world. You have Charon, the ferry driver, who escorts him across. When he gets across into the realm of Hades, there are lots of different things he sees. The dog Cerberus shows up. Minos, the king of Knossos, who is one of the judges of the underworld in Greek mythology. The lands of mourning, where he actually encounters Dido, right, who has now gone on to the underworld after her suicide, reunited with her husband. She refuses, by the way, to talk to Aeneas. He tries to apologize to her, but she doesn't have anything to do with him. You'll go on, you see the road to Tartarus, the pit of Hades, the pit of torment, the lowest portion of Hades, and then ultimately to the Elysian Fields. And the Elysian Fields are the paradise. And it's interesting because all of the people in the Elysian Fields are future Roman historical figures, heroes of ancient Rome, and deceased Trojan warriors. You find the great Trojans in paradise. A lot of the Greek heroes not really here. They don't deserve paradise. It's the Trojans do and the Romans that are attached to that world. Now the whole episode is the Sibyl is bringing him to meet with his father in Chryse so he could have a revelation and a vision of the future greatness of Rome. And he does meet his father here. And book 6 is important. This is the book where, Octavia, the sister of Augustus, faints, supposedly when Vergil reads it to her. Because what you see is this scene where you're looking at the reincarnation. These great Trojan heroes are getting ready, standing in line, drinking from the river of forgetfulness, and getting ready to be reborn into the upper world. Greek and Roman religion was open to the idea of reincarnation. And the idea is there would be a number of years, maybe 1,000 years, and after which you're reborn on Earth. No memory of your past life. And all of these figures, these Trojan heroes, are going to be future Roman figures. Augustus is in there. Julius Caesar is in there. All the major ones from Romulus to Marcellus, and there's the name that made Octavia faint, her son, and the chosen heir, actually, of Augustus. He was married to Augustus's daughter and was kind of his preferred heir, though Marcellus was killed young. Kind of the tragedy. That's why Octavia faints, because he has been recently killed, possibly assassinated. Anyways, all of Roman history is divinely laid out and divinely ordained in this famous book. And the commission is to found Rome. So let's take a look at the actual mission as given in the sixth book of the Aeneid. Others, I can well believe, will hammer out bronze that breathes with more delicacy than us, drawing out living features from the marble. This is a reference to the artistry of the Greeks. They'll plead their causes better, trace with instruments the movement of the sky, and tell the rising of the constellations. All things the Greeks were really well adept to, right? They were great thinkers and philosophers and scientists. Remember, Roman, it's for you to rule the nations with your power. That will be your skill, to crown peace with law, to spare the conquered, and to subdue the proud. These are the things the Romans were known for, right? Law, engineering, practical concerns, government. And this last line, to spare the conquered, subdue the proud. That's important, especially when we get to the end of the poem. But that's his mission. Now, when he departs from the underworld after having been given this mission, he goes out of one of two gates. There is a gate of horn and a gate of ivory. The gate of ivory is where he departs. And this isn't a gate that is known as giving false dreams. This actually goes back to the Odyssey. So here's a line in the Odyssey by Homer. It says, "Stranger, dreams verily are baffling and unclear of meaning, and in no wise do they find fulfillment in all things for men." In other words, you don't know what dreams are trying to communicate to you. "For two are the gates of shadowy dreams, and one is fashioned of horn and one of ivory. Those dreams that pass through the gate of sawn ivory deceive men." So here's the idea. Is what comes through the ivory gate is a deception of some sort. Okay? But those that come forth through the gate of polished horn bring true issues to pass when any mortal sees them. Now, what does that mean? Why is Vergil having Aeneas depart through the gate of false dreams? There have been lots of speculation on this. Vergil doesn't tell us. Possibly, as some have speculated, that this is a critique of Augustus's entire message, this future great, glorious destiny of Rome. Maybe he's, in a backhanded way, critiquing that as an illusion. Okay, that's one possibility. Obviously, it's not what Augustus thought he was saying, or he probably wouldn't have published the thing, may have burned it the way Virgil wanted. Another suggestion is maybe in reference, and I might be a little bit less likely, but it perhaps is a reference to Platonic thought. Plato, one of the great thinkers of the ancient world, distinguishes kind of two realms in his metaphysics: the world of forms, which is real, and the world of matter, the world that we're in here, which is actually not as real. So maybe the idea of him going back to the upper world, or to the world of physical things, is in a way going back to this world that's ultimately, in the end, less real than the world of forms. Okay, so maybe, could be positive, negative, depends how you want to interpret it. I'm not going to go there. I've laid it out good enough, and we'll move on to part 2. Okay, the Iliad, again, the Second Trojan War. He arrives finally at his destination. Right here is Cuma. You can see where the underworld journey was. It's near Naples, by the way, in southern Italy. And he needs to get up to Latium, which is up here. And he goes by sea to his destiny. And he eventually gets there, and he sees the white sow. He is so hungry at one point that they sit down to eat, and all they have are these big flat loaves of bread, which they put their vegetables and fruit on. And as they're tearing the bread and eating it, his son says, "Hey, we're eating our tables." And that's where he realizes that's the prophecy. That's where we're supposed to go. This is where we stop. And finally, he has a home in Latium. Okay, but it's going to be a struggle. And it's a land worth fighting for. So at the time, now we're introduced to some new characters. The king of the region was a guy by the name of Latinus. Talk about a creative name. He's got a daughter, beautiful woman by the name of Lavinia. And she is not married. She is betrothed, but Latinus decides Aeneas would be a good husband for her. As a matter of fact, it's a prophecy that she is supposed to marry a foreigner. And currently, she's engaged to a local guy, the king of the Rutulians, a guy by the name of Turnus. Now, Turnus is favored by the queen. Latinus' wife, Amata, believes Turnus should marry Lavinia. So there's a disagreement within the household who should marry the daughter. Now, Alecto, the spirit sent by Juno, comes down. She's kind of a fury in mythology, and she kind of sparks the animosity that's going to lead to a conflict. The Latin tribes are going to end up backing Turnus, the Rutulians, and they're going to fight against the Trojans to prevent this marriage from taking place. And they're going to try to drive the Trojans away. But the actual conflict starts when Aeneas' son, Ascanius, who's now, pretty much a young adult, kills what was a royal stag. In this offense, by accident, he's hunting, he kills, an animal he shouldn't have killed. This is the one act that sparks the actual conflict, and a war begins. Okay, but ultimately it's a war over a woman. Now, Aeneas leaves. The Trojans build a fortress there in Latium. They're trying to protect themselves, and Aeneas needs allies. So he goes north to the spot that's known as Pallantium, which is the future site of Rome. And at the time in the story, there's supposedly already a settlement there, but it's a Greek settlement, surprisingly. There's a guy there ruling by the name of Evander, and he's going to be an ally of Aeneas. And this is kind of strange. Again, the Greeks are usually the bad guys, but here is one Greek that is definitely viewed as a noble and upright guy. And he not only gives troops to help Aeneas out, he actually sends his son Pallas to help Aeneas. And Pallas is rather young and inexperienced, but he's entrusted in Aeneas' care. And Aeneas is going to take that burden upon himself and really feel a real responsibility for this kid's well-being and survival in the coming conflict. Now, Venus, the mother of Aeneas, is going to provide Aeneas with a suit of armor, reminiscent of Achilles' armor, by the god Vulcan. This is the counterpart to Hephaestus. The full armor is put on. This is going to be incredible. And on the shield, you have the Battle of Actium depicted. So again, Roman history coming in, this future greatness of Rome. Kind of prophesied right there in the armor. The showdown is eventually going to come about. It's going to be Turnus versus Aeneas, the climax of the epic. Now, Turnus has been trying to break into the Trojan camp. He's been fighting with everybody. He's been looking off and on for Aeneas, who has somehow avoided Turnus. And this is basically due to Juno. She doesn't really want Turnus to fight Aeneas because she knows Aeneas is the better warrior. And what happens is he comes upon Pallas on the battlefield. The two fight. Turnus kills the boy, takes as his trophy the sword belt of Pallas, and he wears this. Okay, so it's a triumph for Turnus, but a tragedy for Aeneas. And at this point, Aeneas goes in search of Turnus. Turnus is going to get the match he wants. The two are going to have conflict, but Juno temporarily kind of rescues him a few times from Aeneas's grasp. But in the end, the Etruscans send troops. King Mezentius is killed. Diomedes, which is a famous warrior that I may have mentioned when we did the Iliad, a Greek warrior kind of called to help out, doesn't want to send aid to the Latins. He says, I really don't want to fight Aeneas again. Fought him once at Troy. Don't want to do it. Kind of on your own. But eventually, it's going to have to be Turnus that fights him. Anyways, King Latinus himself actually wants to just grant the Trojans some piece of land, kind of get things settled, but that's not destined to happen. There has to be a climactic duel at the end of the epic. And this is actually where the epic is going to wrap up. Remember, it's left incomplete, but we at least have a completion of this duel. Turnus versus Aeneas. And it turns out very poorly for Turnus. They start out by fighting, and in the midst of the battle, Turnus shatters his sword. He begins to flee. He runs from Aeneas. Aeneas pursues him. Around and around they go. Everybody's lined up watching. There's like a big clearing, and the troops have circled around. But in the end, Turnus, wounded, falls and begs for mercy. And here's where the interesting thing happens. As a matter of fact, he stops and faces Aeneas first. I should have mentioned this. He gets a little bit of moral support from his sister, who happens to be a goddess, kind of a minor divinity by the name of Juturna. Okay, now she kind of resolves his courage, but ultimately she abandons him in the end. This may bring back flashbacks to another story we've already talked about. Anyways, what happens in the end is Aeneas considers sparing Turnus' life, but when he looks down and he sees him wearing the belt of Pallas, he kills him. He's taking revenge. Now, is that the right thing to do? We're going to debate this. What does this mean? Anyways, the story just leaves us here. Like I said, he died in 19 BC. It's incomplete. But let's take a look first before we unpack that at Vergil adopting and adapting Homer. Right? Virgil's a true Roman, but he's drawing on Homer. How did he do it? Right? He's going to improve on the master, and he's going to transform the Iliad. So let's talk about the parallels between Part 2 and the Iliad. Number one, we got a love triangle. You probably didn't miss that. They're fighting over a woman. Turnus and Aeneas are fighting over Lavinia. Same thing with Helen, Menelaus, and Paris. So if you're going to do an analogy here, Helen would be Lavinia. That's the easy one. Menelaus would be Turnus. Okay? And that makes Paris the parallel to Aeneas. Now, this is the part where you're probably scratching your head and saying, okay, what's going on? Why would Vergil want his hero to be a new Paris? Paris was not a noble character. He's the lover, right? He's the one who started the war. He's the one who was the coward, spent more time in the bedroom than on the battlefield. Why would we want Aeneas to be Paris? Well, for the plot is necessary, but notice how he handles the parallel. Here's the big difference, and this is where Vergil, I think, is brilliant. Menelaus and Paris obviously stole the man's wife. He violated a contract. He did the wrong thing, started a war, destroyed his city. Aeneas and Turnus, neither one of them are married to Lavinia. Turnus may be engaged to her, but the father, who really is the one who arranges the marriage in a Roman world anyways, chooses Aeneas. There's no violated marriage. There's no violated contract. Aeneas isn't Paris. He's not hiding the whole time. He's not a coward. Okay? And he's morally not responsible for anything that happens here. So very much he's preserving, again, the reputation and morality of the main character. That's what the Romans need. Okay? The next big scene is the concluding episodes, right? The contest of champions for the most part. Patroclus, Hector, and Achilles all over again. Patroclus is clearly a parallel to Pallas. Who kills Patroclus? Hector. Who kills Pallas? That's, again, Turnus. Which means Aeneas is going to be the new Achilles. But again, is he like Achilles? Yes and no. You got to be careful. Again, Achilles was a man completely consumed by rage. Aeneas is not. Aeneas is, for the most part, pretty even-tempered. Now, he will kill Turnus in the end, the way Achilles kills Hector, and he does it in anger, but there's a little bit of a difference, and I want to point that out because, for the Romans, the character of Aeneas is not supposed to be a wild man, right? He's a civilizing character. So let's talk about these virtues one more time. True Roman virtue is supposed to be encapsulated in the character of Aeneas. He's pious Aeneas. Pietas, your duties in hierarchy. God's first. Obedient to the call he is. He's got a mission. And he carries his household gods with him. Not just his father on his back. He carries his gods with him. So he's a man of religion. He's about country, right? He, for the sake of his people, he's doing this trip, right? He's bringing exiles. It's an exodus, kind of like a Moses figure. He's trying to bring them to a new homeland in Italy. Very important. His dedication next to his families, his dependents, ancestors, and descendants. This also comes out in the character of Aeneas. He carries his father along with his gods. He buries his father with honor and funeral games. He leads his son from Troy and to Italy, and then prepares his son Ascanius to be the next leader, kind of looking both forward and backward to his ancestors and his future descendants. All of this is tied up in the pivotal figure of Aeneas. Where does he fall? Doesn't really fall on the map, right? And almost nothing he does, with the brief exception of his relationship with Dido, was about him. He would have liked to have stayed in Carthage. He was happy there. He loved her, maybe not as much as she loved him, but then again, he wasn't under a magic spell from Cupid. But he abandons her when he's called to. He does the thing where he has to set aside his own desires to do something more important. Okay, so this is supposed to be the model we get in Aeneas. Among the ancient virtues, the writers of the ancient world often talked about the cardinal virtues. There are 4 of these. Fortitudo, which is courage, bravery. Prudentia, which is wisdom. Temperantia, and these are the Latin terms for it, by the way, for self-control, and justitia for justice. We'll take a look at all of these, but let's start with justice. This is the idea of order. In the story, he is called to show mercy to the defeated. Remember, that is his mission that's given to him in Hades. At the end, he kills Turnus, a man who's clearly begging for mercy, which brings up the question of whether or not he's fulfilling the virtues that he's supposed to represent. This is retributive, right? This is actually part of justice. Not only mercy, we can question whether even mercy is part of justice. Mercy seems to be an exception to justice. Justice entails balancing of things. And retribution is usually an element in justice, the idea of paying back what's owed. And clearly Aeneas avenges people who are under his care, Pallas being the one that we're talking about. Okay, so he does seem to be a model of justice, and therefore, very clearly in the role of hero as a role model. We've talked about this from the very beginning. The question is he truly a virtuous man? Well, in the sense of Aristotle, who give us a lot of writing on virtue, Aristotle's virtuous man is one who is naturally virtuous without struggle, the man who has kind of internalized virtue to the degree where it's actually become a second nature. It's a perfection of one's faculties to do naturally the things a virtuous man would do. He doesn't seem to quite be there. When we look at Aeneas, there is a struggle for him. He wants to stay in Carthage, but he has to pull himself away. He wants to, stay with Dido, but he has to break that relationship. He even wants probably to show mercy to Turnus, but in the end, he doesn't do it. He's very human in this aspect, right? His anger gets the best of him at the very end, so we could question, is it completely just what he does? Because it does seem to violate his calling, but there's still this idea of transformation. For a human and a hero, you need to struggle for you to transform, okay? It can't come easily. But he's still, I think, a model of virtue. You can question that, but I think outwardly, in the end, he does what needs to be done. He acts, at least, like the virtuous man. And that's really all you need in the character, because he's supposed to be a role model for the culture. He may not be Aristotle's idea of virtuous man, but he clearly is a virtuous man, I think, from a Roman perspective. The other virtues, let's talk about prudentia, which is wisdom. Clearly, we're not going to talk about courage. He's courageous, that's no doubt. But prudentia, this connects him back with this idea of being a new Odysseus. Let's contrast him with Odysseus real quickly. Odysseus is the craftiest of Greek heroes. He's incredibly intelligent. But we can question whether he's wise. Now, Aeneas, here's what wisdom is. Wisdom is the ability to use your knowledge in the proper ways, to see and make the right choices. Aeneas takes proper advice and proper course of action. He listens to the warnings he's given. He doesn't cross the boundaries. He does what it takes to bring his people home safely. And you got to contrast this with who Aeneas refers to as wily Ulysses. This is the Roman version of Odysseus. Wily, he's crafty, he's smart, but he's not wise. What does Odysseus do wrong? Well, He's famous for being smart, but he lacked the wisdom because ultimately he's prideful. When it comes to the island of the Cyclopses, he can make his way free of the danger of the Cyclopses rescuing his men, but instead he decides in the very end to brag, to give the Cyclops his name, which ultimately calls a curse down on Odysseus, which leads to the next 10 years of his wandering and suffering. Okay, so he's foolish. And in the course of his journeys, he loses every man entrusted to his care. His entire crew is lost by the time he gets home. He stays for a long time in these long-term relationships with witches like Circe and Calypso before he ever goes home to the wife that is waiting for him. This is not what the Romans wanted in a hero. Aeneas, by contrast, goes to a lot of the same places, but he avoids Polyphemus. He avoids the Cyclops. He even saves one of Odysseus' men, Echimenides, who is trapped on the island this whole time. He avoids Scylla and Charybdis, where Odysseus loses some of his men. He leads his people ultimately home safely, preserving the majority of them, and abandons Dido rather quickly compared to Odysseus, who stays too long with Calypso and Circe. So he's like Odysseus, but again, he's not Odysseus. He's much wiser than Odysseus. He also exhibits temperantia, or self-control. Unlike Achilles, who is a picture of rage, Aeneas is not. He might be considered a Stoic type of a character. Stoicism is a philosophy of the ancient world where mastery of the emotions was an incredibly important aspect of one's life. Apatheia is what it's called, the idea of not having passions, or at least destructive emotions, rule you. Now, he does have emotions, so he's not completely apathetic in a Stoic sense. But he is definitely a self-sacrificing hero. He's willing to, again, put his desires at the end. So this is to contrast again with Achilles. He's not wrathful. Achilles is angry. He's bad-tempered and sulky, stays in his tent the entire Iliad for the most part, has absolutely no consideration of mercy. Even before he fights Hector, he says, I'm not showing mercy, right? I'm not going to give you a proper burial. I'm not going to forgive or forget anything. Whereas Aeneas is not driven by rage. He's much more even-tempered or good-tempered, and he considers mercy with Turnus. Right? When he does kill him in anger, you think of it again as a vengeance for a death of Pallas, which is entrusted to him. You can think of it maybe as a duty. Maybe he's falling down in a little way. Maybe there's a little bit of a lack of piety in the end, maybe not a complete mastery of self-control. But relatively speaking, he's not an Achilles, and that's exactly what you want to avoid. You don't want your Roman hero to be a madman like Achilles. Okay, so Vergil, like I said, he brilliantly does this. And that final act, right, it's out of anger, and we can question whether he fails, again, the duty right here to spare the conquered and subdue the proud. Is this justice? Is this justitia? Hard to say. You can make a case probably both ways, and I'm sure there have been plenty of scholars that have done this and taken on that task. But it's an incredibly complex epic. This is definitely political propaganda if you didn't get that from the beginning. But it's for a purpose. And it's at the same time, this is the thing that makes it so neat, at the same time, it's wonderful art, great poetry, and incredibly influential. I mean, Dante's Divine Comedy, the Inferno, right, the Journey into Hell, that's one of the most famous works of the Middle Ages, or the early Renaissance. Dante casts Vergil as one of the characters in his descent, right? Vergil is the one who leads Dante into the underworld, just the way the Sibyl led Aeneas into the underworld. Very much inspired, and lots of other works of literature have been inspired by the poem of the Aeneid. So at this point, I think you've got a pretty good overview of a wonderful epic, my favorite of the ancient epics. But for now, we are done with the Greco-Roman world, probably for the end of the semester. Next time, we're going to be turning our attention back to the world of the Germanic peoples, the Anglo-Saxons. We're going to be taking a look at the Epic of Beowulf.